Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are, however you are doing. Thank you for joining me today. Chapter 7, The Road to Revolution. We're going to get started. Just go ahead and get right on in with question number 1 here. The revolution was in the blank of the people. Question number 1. John Adams in 1818 said the revolution was in the hearts and the minds of the people. After the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, the British had a problem. Victory and the need to garrison 10,000 troops was rather expensive. But the American people were in no way revolutionary. They were called reluctant revolutionaries. Question number 2. The colonists until late in the day sought only to claim what? The colonists originally felt they were only fighting to claim the rights of Englishmen. They had no intent of independence. They originally were fighting for the rights of Englishmen. That was their purpose. They believed they were only fighting the rights of Englishmen. There's a couple of ideas here that had taken root in the minds of the American colonists. One of which is the idea of republicanism. Republicanism is the idea where a society all subordinate their private and selfish interests to the common good. And then you're represented by a system of voting where you have a representational government. You don't have it's not a democracy where everybody gets a vote. No, you have elected officials or aristocrats or like the Senate in the Roman times who voted. But it was not just one person, it was a wide group. Our textbook says both the stability of society and the authority of government thus depended on the virtue of the citizenry, its capacity for selflessness, self-sufficiency, courage, and civic involvement. By its very nature, republicanism was opposed to hierarchical structures and authoritarian institutions such as a monarchy. The second idea that came from a group of people called the Radical Whigs. The Whigs feared the threat to liberty posed by the power of the monarch and its minister and his ministers, compared to the power of the elected body or the parliament. Those are two ideas that were festering in the back of the minds of the of the revolutionaries. The Democrat. I said Republicans, now I say Democrats. It's not Republican and Democrats. Sorry about that. It is the British, the redcoats, the royalists, if I can get the right word in my mind here. They had an idea in their mind too. But it's important to note that only one of the 13, not one of the original 13 colonies except for Georgia was formally planted by the British government or English government. This was not, the colonies were not originally founded by England. They were English people per se, but they were not formally founded by the English government. There's an idea of mercantilism, okay, and this is question number 3. What is mercantilism? Mercantilists believed that wealth was power, and that a country's economic wealth, and hence its military and political power, could be measured by the amount of gold or silver in its treasury. All right. So basically, they believed the power of a country was based on its wealth. To amass this amount, a country needed to export more than it imported. Possessing colonies thus conferred distinct advantages, since the colonies could supply both the raw materials of the mother country, and which reduced the need for imports, and provide a guaranteed market for exports. Now, as I'm doing this lecture, the day before and the day I'm doing this lecture, President Donald Trump has met with the European Union about trade, imports, and exports. Just to put a little modern comparison curve in this, a little bit of discussion, there is clearly a mercantilistic aspect from our president's current policy. Like him, dislike him, I'm not talking about him per se. I'm talking about the idea that your country's power is based off of your exports and your imports. And if you are importing more than your exports, it is a weakness in your country. And that was what the British here believed, and that is also, I think, fairly evident in what our president may possibly believe. But this goes to show this idea existed by the British back then may exist today. This is an idea that the trade deficits, trade exports, imports, that all have a very influential part in our government. And the reason why I mention that is these concept of tariffs and imports and exports. Okay, that is not something that just started last year with President Trump. It's not something that started 150 years ago. No. This goes back to our earliest days in our nation and our trade. And this goes back to the Atlantic trade and the triangular trade. This concept will be discussed a lot, and I believe it's like chapter 11 or something, around the time of Andrew Jackson, the 1830s. But tariffs and mercantilism and imports and exports and all that play a very big role in our country's history. Number 4, what benefits did the Republicans, said it again, what benefits did the revolutionaries or the Americans or the colonists gain from being part of the British Empire? The British Empire provided them with protection from the world's mightiest navy, provided them a strong army of redcoats, all that at cost. Those are the two things you can put the answers there. It also provided them, as one person said, the freest country in the entire world was the British people. And the freest people in the British Empire were the American colonists. Therefore, the freest people in the world were the ones who decided that the restrictions placed on them were too much and decided to fight for liberty. That's an interesting thought there. I'm going to continue on, but in 1763, British mercantilism really became into impact. And you'll find here in 1763, 1764, and 1765 that this is when the leaders of the Revolution and the leaders of the War for Independence really got going, and they got their spirit up. And this is where a lot of their anger came from. George Washington, for example, the tariffs on his crops as a farmer he planted and was shipping, etc. That caused him a major problem. In 1763, the Navigation Acts were really started being enforced, and that is, the Navigation Acts is that you could not ship something to a foreign country. You had to ship it to a British port, and then that port could sign off and allow it to be shipped to somewhere else. But you could not ship straight from the colonies to anywhere else. That meant the Bahamas. That meant the West Indies. Sorry, not the Bahamas. That's part of the West Indies. Whatever French or Spanish possession down there at the time, Dutch possessions, Spain, France, Norway, and not England, any European country, North Africa, West Africa, etc. They had to go through a British port, and when they went through that British port, they taxed it, and then that way the British government got their taxes, and the British economy was subsidized. It's protectionism, simply put. It imposed a dependency on British agents and creditors, and many of them just found it debasing. John Hancock amassed his fortune by smuggling, and smuggling became a very honorable profession in early America. What did Britain gain after the 7 years or French and Indian War? French and Indian War is the same as the 7 Years' War. They gained victory. They gained control of Canada. They gained control of some various colonies, and they separated the French. They gained superiority in the seas. But what they lost, or what else they gained, you could say, was a massive debt. Our book says 140 million. Now I want to specify here. 140 million is not in today's money. That's 140 million in that day's money. I have no idea what that is in today's money, but let's say it's, and put it in GDP terms. Okay, our current we spend around $4 trillion a year, or bring in about $4 trillion a year in GDP. I would say it would have been at least worth 1 year's worth of our GDP percentage-wise compared to them. So let's just pretend, for the sake of discussion, that it was $4 trillion. Now you see why they felt like they had to tax so much. About half of that debt had been incurred defending the American colonies. To pay for that debt, they felt like, and Prime Minister George Grenville said, all right, we need to enforce the navigation law so we can start recouping some of this money. And he also passed the Sugar Act of 1764. Number 6, what was the Sugar Act and its significance? The Sugar Act was the first law ever passed by that body, by Parliament, for raising tax revenue in the colonies for the Crown. This was the first time that Parliament ever passed a taxation onto the colonies. And this is what the real strife came from this, from the Sugar Act in 1764. That's where the real strife started. Before that, there's a little frustration here and there, but all of a sudden, you have a foreign body passing it. The Americans were furious. They argued no taxation without representation. We're not represented in Parliament. How dare they vote to have taxes for us? The Stamp Act was passed in 1765. And the Stamp Act mandated the use of stamped paper on various stuff. All legal documents, playing cards, newspapers, pamphlets, diplomas, all etc. And every time you stamped it, you had to go and ask and pay for this tax. It was a way to raise money. The British regarded this simply as, okay, we're trying to pay for the money that we're spending to protect you. Okay? The colonists however, said, hey, we're not represented in Parliament. How dare they pass a law taxing us? And you see here the conflict. There's a taxation, but there's no representation. But at the same time, the people that they're taxing are the people that incurred most of the expenses. There's also the Quartering Act, and that is number 7. The Quartering Act was, they basically sent troops over to the American colonies and required them to live in the colonies, but also the colonies to quarter them, provide for them, and that included like housing. Like you would find actual British soldiers staying in houses of colonists, and by law and by force. And if you can imagine the U.S. Army coming and saying, "Sorry, you have to go up your bedroom and you have to sleep on the couch so that you can provide a room for a soldier," why that wouldn't go over well for you, and nor did it go over well for them. Other things were British troops were to be tried in England. The colonists asked the question, why is a British army needed here now? We've already defeated the French and the Indians are routed, so why is British troops here? Who are they trying to guard against? They felt like they were guarding on them. The Stamp Act, the virtual representation. Number 8, no taxation without representation. Lord Grenville in Parliament responded, you're represented. Parliament represents, every member of Parliament represents every member of the British Empire. Therefore, you are represented, but you are not elected. Parliament is not elected. You have no vote in who's elected for Parliament, but Parliament represents you. Okay? Grenville claimed that every member of Parliament represented all British subjects. This is ridiculous, as you can clearly see. Obviously, a member elected in the township of Kent is going to care mostly about what's going on in the township of Kent and how it impacts the township of Kent's policies. He is not going to care if their higher taxes are raised on Charleston, South Carolina, so the township of Kent has lower taxes. He's going to be in favor of that. Similarly today, if you can imagine today if we had imagine this horrific outcome. If anybody here is from California, I apologize because I'm about to offend your state. But imagine if we had 10 representatives all elected from San Francisco. All right? These 10 representatives are elected and they're all from San Francisco, but they represent the entire United States. And they pass laws that have to be upheld in the entire United States. And they say, and you and I, me from rural Pennsylvania, you from rural Ohio, rural Kentucky, or wherever you're from, or rural Cincinnati, rural Cincinnati, they'd say, this is crazy. You in San Francisco know nothing about what's going on here in rural Ohio. You're making a tax on tractors that you don't even have tractors in San Francisco. You can imagine you would not feel represented at all. You would feel this idea of virtual representation is bunk. And that is how they felt. Parliament was forced to repeal the Stamp Act, however, because of a boycott. The independence movement, or the colonists, as I'm going to call them, they were not independence movement at the time. The colonists fought back by boycotting British goods. As a result, machinery for collecting the tax broke down. The law was openly and flagrantly defied in the United States, but England was hit hard. America had, right about that time, bought 1/4 of all British exports, and about 1/2 of all British shipping was devoted to American trade. As you can imagine, the colonists were refusing to buy British trade and British exports, etc. All of a sudden, boom. That would massively hurt the British economy, and that's what happened. Loud demand was converged on Parliament for repeal of the Stamp Act, and thus it was repealed. King George stepped in and repealed it. But the question for many of the British people is why do 7.5 million British people have to pay heavy taxes to protect the colonies, whereas only 2 million colonists have to pay for 1/3 of the cost of their own defense? And this goes back to the question here. And we have to, it's a reminder here that the American colonists were not fighting against the taxes. They were fighting because they weren't represented. And sometimes these are confused, and especially as many, including myself, are for lower taxes. But the Americans were fighting against taxes, but the point was they were fighting that they had no representation or choice about the taxes. Some colonies wanted no taxation. Others had, like Massachusetts, actually had some taxation, but they felt like they were represented in that taxation. Describe the Boston, number 9, describe the Boston Massacre and name a famous individual killed in the event. The Boston, the Townshend TX and the Boston Massacre, there's a number of taxes that the British introduced. One of them is the Townshend Acts, or the Townshend Tea Act. Okay, and what happened was there's 2 regiments of troops in Boston in 1768 that were landed there. Many of these were drunken and profane characters. Okay, they were not nice people. A lot of these were brigands. They had been brigands and or ruffians as in England and Britain, and they had been forced to join the military. They were not known for being upright and moral citizenry, and the colonists tormented the soldiers. Sort of today, you see a sort of similar thing at times when you hear people yelling and cursing out police. This is sort of what happened with the British. You can imagine if the troops aren't allowed to do anything to you, a bunch of kids get a bunch of snowballs, start throwing them at the soldiers all the time. Everywhere a redcoat goes, somebody's yelling at him or cursing at him or throwing a snowball at him, and the anger that these troops would build up. On the evening of March 5th, some 60 townspeople set upon a squad of about 10 redcoats. It basically became a mob of people, and they sort of attacked and really were going after these redcoats. And one of them was hit by a club, and another was apparently knocked down. Apparently with acting without orders, but under extreme provocation, the textbook says, the troops opened fire and killed or wounded 11 innocent citizens. And I say innocent with quotation marks. One of the first to die was Crispus Attucks, described by contemporaries as I'm reading here from the textbook, a powerfully built runaway mulatto and as a leader of the mob. That is what happened here in the Boston Massacre and the famous individual. Now it is important to note, in the trial that followed, John Adams, our second president of the United States, and a person who fought hard for the War of Independence, represented as a defense attorney the soldiers, because he believed they deserved a fair trial, and many of the more sober-minded colonists believed that the incident was provoked by the colonists themselves. King George III, and King George III is an interesting character. when he was brought forth to be king, his mother told him, "George, be king." He was trying to take back and bring power to the royalty, and through this, he was a tremendous ruler for most of history, except for the American Revolution. And at this time, he relied on his Prime Minister, Lord North, who made some strategic decisions that were not very wise. There's an individual here I'm going to talk about, Sam Adams. Who is Sam Adams? Sam Adams is the father of the American Revolution. All right? This man made the revolution happen. You're going to hear me say this a couple different times. Without this person, the Revolutionary War never happened, and we are not a people. There's a couple people you can say that really and truly happened. Okay, Samuel Adams, George Washington are on the top of that list. Without those two, this war never happens. There's another individual, I'm trying to think of his name off the top of my head, but a businessman from Philadelphia who financed the war. But these two individuals, but right now we're talking about Sam Adams. Sam Adams is the man who started the revolution. He was a rebellious, libertarian-minded individualist who refused to have authority on him. He lived and breathed only for politics. If you can imagine, he went every day arguing politics, discussing politics, shouting, arguing for freedom, and formed what the Sons of Liberty. To be real honest, he was a revolutionary, a bit of a rioter, and definitely someone who was a provocateur. The textbook says he appealed effectively to what he called his trained mob. This is someone who is a brilliant leader, a brilliant strategist, a brilliant propagandist. He was someone who fought zealously, tenaciously, and courageously against the infraction of colonial rights. Without Samuel Adams, this war does not happen. Samuel Adams, by the way, was a very, very devout Christian. An extremely devout Christian. Which is where he believed where a lot of his fervency and passion came from. Okay, so you're going to know, who is Sam Adams? He is a very devout Christian who was a master propagandist and an engineer of rebellion. Okay, he is the person who drove this revolutionary mindset. He's the one who caused these events in Boston to happen. All right. Without Samuel Adams, there is no Lexington and Concord. There is no Boston Tea Party. There is no Revolutionary War. All right? Samuel Adams is the father of the Revolution. He also set up correspondence committees to discuss his revolutionary ideas as well. Continuing on to the next question here. What was the Boston Tea Party? The Boston Tea Party was there was a law passed to provide beneficiary to the tea of the British East India Company. The colonists rejected the idea of this tax, etc., and went and refused to allow these ships to dock that were bringing in British tea. In Boston, a British official required the tea to be delivered. Our textbook says Thomas Hutchinson. Ironically, Hutchinson agreed that the tea tax was unjust, but he believed even more strongly that the colonists had no right to flout the law. Therefore, he ordered the tea ships not to leave the harbor until unloaded. All right. That night, or a couple nights later, on December 16th, and I say a couple nights, it may have been more than a few nights. A bunch of Indians, a bunch of colonists dressed up as Indians, snuck on to and dumped the contents of 342 chests of tea into the British harbor, into the Boston harbor, which was a British harbor. The British tea into the Boston harbor. So to this day, they still say you can taste the tea in the Boston harbor waters. I don't know if that's quite true. That is what they say. A silent crowd watched approvingly as the salty tea was dumped in, as the salty tea was brewed for the fish, the textbook says. Again, that is the Boston Tea Party. I'm just going to keep moving right on here. The Boston Port Act was a response to that, which ordered that that the port be closed until they paid for the damages and the tea. Boston refused to do so. The port is closed. The largest port, or one of the largest, if not the largest, one of the largest three ports, along with Charleston and maybe New Orleans. But the main port there in New England was closed then. And you can imagine this just crushed their economy, etc. That is the Boston Port Act. What were the Intolerable Acts? The Intolerable Acts were a series of acts that were passed that that frustrated the colonists. Among those specifically was the Quebec Act, and the Intolerable Acts is there are several here that you can point out. And I'm going to let you go ahead, if you're watching this lecture, you can go ahead and skip over the question on the Intolerable Acts if you would like. And we're going to jump right to the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act, this is question number 14. One of the Intolerable Acts was the Quebec Act, and if you look on page 134, it gave much of the Ohio River Valley and Ohio and etc., the west of the Alleghenies, to Quebec, and allowed that to be settled by Catholics. This infuriated the Protestants because, remember, the Puritans and the Protestants had came to get away from Catholicism, and they wanted a place where there was no Catholics and wanted a purified, pure and holy living Puritan Protestant church. They believed they had been fighting literal wars, killing each other in Europe over Protestantism and Catholicism, and their mortal enemies were Catholics. One angry Protestant cried that there ought to be a jubilee in hell over this enormous gain for popery. All right? Young Alexander Hamilton voiced the fears of many colonists when he warned that the Quebec Act would introduce priestly tyranny, making that country another Spain or Portugal. Does not your blood run cold, Alexander Hamilton asked, to think that an English Parliament should pass an act for the establishment of arbitrary power and popery in such a country? Here again we find religion, moral beliefs, Christianity, theology tied in intrinsically with history. You cannot understand why this would infuriate the colonists so much if you did not understand the background of the colonists and the Protestants fighting against the Catholics and fighting for religious freedom and fighting for the right to create a pure and holy society. Continental Congress. What did the First Continental Congress do? They called for a complete boycott of British goods. They did not call for independence. They organized for the first time, but they also wrote several dignified papers, including a Declaration of Rights, and wrote several appeals to the king, asking for him to give them rights such as perhaps different than the British than the Parliament was giving them at the current time, and to maybe rule them where they could answer to the crown, but not to Parliament. We come here to Lexington and Concord. Why were number 16? Why were the British marching on Lexington and Concord? Well, very simply, there was a couple of people who were part of a group that wanted to overthrow the British in Boston. They were revolutionaries. They were starting chaos. They were starting riots. They were, in a sense, domestic terrorists. Let's be real and honest about this. These people were calling for the overthrow of the government and trying to support it, and were establishing groups and organizations fighting back against the existing government. All right, they were in a sense you could call them right-wing militia, okay, but not in the sense of like mass murdering people like we think of sometimes, like the Oklahoma City bombing. No, these were right-wing militia in the sense that they were domestic terrorists in the sense that they were arguing for the complete overthrow or the destruction of the British government and fighting against the British government basically in all manners except for violence. They had not committed and were not committing any acts of violence. That's a very important distinction. Those two individuals I'm talking about are Samuel Adams, the father of the Revolution, and John Hancock, who was bankrolling much of his operation and who was bankrolling much of the Republican, much of the revolutionary ideals. All right. because of that, the British marched to capture them. On the way, while they were there, they're also going to pick up and capture some cannon, which they heard were in Concord. Now, cannon, couldn't use cannon for hunting. The only thing those cannon could be used for was to fight against the British. So they had weapons that were specifically to be used to fight against the British. Okay, they were not. You couldn't use cannon against the Indians. There was no Indians for several hundred miles. This was not an area of danger of Indian attacks for hundreds of years. This was simply the cannon was there to fight against the British. They knew it. There's weapons being collected, and there's militiamen that are out there saying they're going to revolutionary, saying they want to overthrow us, fight us. They decided to go capture them, pick up this cannon, and try to defuse the situation. In the process, they accidentally lit the spark that became the American Revolution. At Lexington, the Minutemen there refused to disperse rapidly enough. A shot was fired, the shot that was heard around the world. Rapidly, there became fighting at Lexington. It spread to Concord, and eventually, on the way back, the British troops were just massacred as they marched slowly back along a path with Colonial and Massachusetts riflemen, and just picking them off, hidden in the bushes and behind the stone walls, just running, shoot, reload, and run down, wait, shoot again, and we find that the losses here were massive. At the time of the war, and you will note that was question number 16. At the time of the war, there was a considerable population advantage for the British, and they had a large treasury. So they could also hire. They ended up hiring several thousand troops. What group of people openly cheered the American victories? That was the Whigs. The English Whig faction, which openly cheered American victories, at least at the onset. They believed that the battle for British freedom was being fought in America. They said if King George triumphed, his rule at home might become tyrannical. They believed that the Americans were fighting for freedom, and that was that's what's going on there. One notable individual that fought for the American cause was Marquis de Lafayette. He was a Frenchman who left France wealthy and at age 19 fought for liberty. He was a major general in the colonial army, and did do some. He also gave some $200,000 of his own to the American Revolution. The colonists fought the entire war disorganized. They had no president. They had no real functioning body of representation. They only had the Continental Congress, but they were very dysfunctional. And they fought the entire war, almost the entire war, before adopting a written constitution, which is known as the Articles of Confederation in 1781. Last couple questions here. Who was not armed at the start of the war? Well armed at the start of the war. People that were not armed at the start of the war, well armed, was the Americans. Reading in their textbook, legend to the contrary, I believe it's supposed to say contrary to the popular legend, colonial Americans were not a well-armed people. Firearms were to be found in only a small minority of households, and many of those guns were the property of the local militia. Not a single gun factory existed in the colonies, and he says, small wonder that only 1 in 12 an American militiaman reported for duty with his own musket. Okay, this is interesting. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the Second Amendment, but it's often thought that everyone in America at that time owned a weapon. That is not true. Only 1 in 12 militiamen that reported for duty actually had a functioning musket. All right? Who is Baron von Steuben? Baron von Steuben is another guy who, without him, we would not have won our freedom. I smile because I say that's my third time I've said that in this lecture, but it is true. Baron von Steuben was a drill master, a genius, an organizational genius, who could not speak English. But during Valley Forge, he had come to America. He was a Prussian military expert who had been part of seeing a lot of wars and strategy, and was an expert. And he drilled and trained the American troops during the Valley Forge. In bitter cold, he had them out there training, learning to stand and fight, learning to follow commands, learning to work as a unit, as a team, as an organization. And you look at the American troops, how they fought before before Valley Forge and after, there is no comparison. Before Valley Forge, there was a bunch of ragtag group of people trying to get them to stay together and forcing them. After Valley Forge, it was iron-shapen, tough, hardened men. They would not back down from anything, and they stood their ground, and they never cowered. Okay? That is a very big difference than previously before that. And so without Baron von Steuben yelling his commands in German that no one understood and had to be translated by someone else, they would not have got there. But he trained them how to do it, how to use a bayonet, how to fire and volley, and all of that stuff. One more note here. How many blacks fought and died for the American cause? And I'm reading out right out of the textbook here. It says, blacks also fought and died for the American cause. Although many states initially barred them from military service, by war's end, more than 5,000 blacks had enlisted in the American armed forces. Okay? So around 5,000 African Americans, which is what they would become, fought for the American cause. That is important to remember, and especially considering the amount there. You'll note that Washington's army never was more than 20,000. Now that's not 20,000 at a time. Our textbook says that maybe as many as several 100,000 men fought at various times against British troops, but not all at once. Thousands of slaves also fled plantations to join and fight for the British, and after the war, in exchange for their freedom. And after the war, the British kept their word and gave them freedom. Those who had fought, as many as 14,000 black loyalists were taken to Nova Scotia, Jamaica, and England as a result of fighting for the British. You will note that means that there's close to 19,000, probably around 20,000 blacks or African Americans, as they would become, fought for, at least those who stayed, fought in the Revolutionary War on one side or the other. Both groups fighting for their freedom. One of James Madison's slaves was caught trying to escape behind the British lines. James Madison refused to punish him. Okay, for coveting, and I'm quoting, for coveting that liberty that white Americans proclaimed the right and worthy pursuit of every human being. This was recognized even by he became our future president. This right for freedom and fight for freedom was recognized by a future president, even at that time, even a slave-owning individual. All right, that is actually the end of chapter 7. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.